Hello, everybody, and welcome to International Women's Talmud Day. I am one of your hosts, Liz Shane, and I will be talking to you today about why we wrote down the oral law and what happens next. So, as advertised, this year is going to be talking about the Gemara and how it became the book we know and love. So the first part of this story is going to be the story of why this is a question in the first place. What exactly is Torah She'Ba'al Peh, and what is so important about this Ba'al Peh, by heart, not written down part? And then the second part is going to be significant moments in the development of the book that is the Gemara that turns it into the book that we know and love today. We will be talking a little bit more about books later. As was noted in the description, this year is intended for advanced beginners and up. I sort of expect that you have seen a page of Talmud before and have maybe learned it once or twice. If you haven't, I highly, highly recommend checking out one of the beginner shiurim, and that should more than put you in place for what I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to begin by going all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to the Gemara itself, when it talks about what exactly the oral law is and why exactly this is an important question for us. So let's go see what the Gemara has to say about its own development. And all right. We start with the Gemara in Gittin. So this Gemara is in the middle of a conversation about how the Torah is divided up. So you can see I've marked off, we're right at the beginning on Daf Samach Amud Bet, page 60, side 2. And the Gemara reads, Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Torah rov bichtav umeut al peh. So most of the Torah is written down, and the smaller portion of it is orally transmitted. Shenamar, as the pasuk says, Achtov lo ruvi torati k'mo zar nichshaval. I have written for him most of my Torah. That is the important part for our purposes. So because it says I have written Achtov ruvi torati, most of my Torah for him, that's how we know that most of the Torah is written down. The Rabbi Yochanan Amar, and Rabbi Yochanan says, Rov al peh u'miut bichtav. Most of the Torah is not written down, is the oral law, and only a little bit of it is bichtav. To think of it in our terms, is there more Tanakh or is there more Gemara? They wouldn't have exactly had that language, but it helps to conceptualize it for us. Shenamar, and Rabbi Yochanan also brings a pasuk, Ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela, because the pasuk says in Shemot Lamed Daled, Ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela karati itcha brit. Because of these things, but also al pi in this case means ba'al peh, by mouth, by memorization, orally. I have contracted this covenant with you. So Rabbi Yochanan wants to read this as saying, because of these ba'al peh things, was my covenant contracted with you. Okay, so the Gemara is like, great, we now have two sages who think two different things, and both have psukim to support it. So let's see if we can find a way to distinguish between the two. The idach nami, and for the other sage, as in for Rabbi Yochanan, haktiv, doesn't it also say, Achtov lo rubi torati? I will write for him most of my Torah. So how does he translate that pasuk? Hahu itzmuhe kamatme. So Rabbi Yochanan would say, no, you have to read that pasuk as if you're surprised. Achtov lo rubi torati. Is it true that I wrote for him my most of my Torah? Halo k'mo zar nichshavu. If I did, wouldn't he be considered just like a non-Jew? So it is precisely all of the non-written elements of the Torah that distinguish us from those who are not Jewish. And if I wrote all of it down, then we'd just be the same as non-Jews. So Rabbi Yochanan is kind of giving us reading marks, like, oh no, just sort of surprise and shock when you read this pasuk. And if you read it that way, then it makes sense with his understanding of the world that is mostly ba'al peh and only slightly bichtav. Okay, so and then v'idach nami, and for the other sage, for Rabbi Elazar, haktiv, doesn't he also have the pasuk ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela? This pasuk that says al pi ba'al peh, how does he read that? to make it make sense with his rov bichtav and meyutz ba'al peh, his mostly written, slightly oral translation. Hahu mishum ditkife lemigmarinhu. So actually, it's not that it's not that there's more in Alpi, but it's telling you that that's the more difficult ones. That the reason that the brit is contingent on that which is Alpi, as the pasuk says, is not because it's more numerous, it's because it's more complicated. So they both manage to read the psukim in ways that make their attitudes make sense. And so the Gemara, now having started on this topic of bichtav in writing and ba'al peh orally, continues. Darash Rabbi Yochanan bar Nachmani, v'turgamana de Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, kitiv kitov v'chat hadvarim ha'ela, v'kitiv ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela. So Rabbi Yehudah bar Nachmani, who was the translator for Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, says we have these two psukim, one that says achtov and one which says al pi. How do we get them to work together? Haketzad, how is this possible? And his answer underlines as follows. Dvarim shebichtav iya tayrashai lo ram al peh. So that which is written down, that which was transmitted through writing, you are not permitted to say orally. Dvarim shabal al peh iya tayrashai lo ram bichtav. And on the other hand, things that were given orally, you don't have permission to write down. Okay. Debei Rabbi Yishmael Tana, Ela. And the house of Rabbi Yishmael learned something similar from the word Ela. So when the pasuk says, Al pi hadvarim ha'ela, or Achtov lo Rabbi Torati doesn't bring this up. So this is the other pasuk for Kitov v'chat hadvarim ha'ela that Rabbi Yehudah bar Nachmani's translator mentioned. It says, the Ela, meaning these are the ones you should write down. But you shouldn't write down halacha. So the Ela that is ba'al peh is the things that need to remain oral, and the Ela that is bichtav are the things that need to remain bichtav. And then Amar Rabbi Yochanan adds on top of this, Lo karata kadosh baruch hu brit im Yisrael, so Ela bishvil dvarim sheba'al peh. So the only reason that God created this covenant with his people Israel was for the things that are given orally. Shenamar, as the pasuk says, Ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela karati tcha brit ve'et Yisrael. So we see clearly from this pasuk, because of these things, the al peh things, I have created this covenant with Israel. So what we have here is this strong distinction that the rabbis are drawing between things that are written down and things that are ba'al peh. We see this clear distinction in the way that we talk about it now as Torah shebichtav, meaning Tanakh, and Torah sheba'al peh, meaning the Gemara and halacha. So that was clearly evident here, and they had very strong opinions about how it needed to be transmitted. Rashi, interestingly enough, talks about why. And he said, in the underlined area, so Mikan, from here, atalamed shehat Talmud lo nitan lichtav ela mipnei shehat Torah mishtchacha. So the only reason that we were allowed to write down the Talmud was that there was this concern of the Torah being forgotten, which you don't actually see anywhere in this text. But he's trying to give a reason, because he, speaking as a sage in the in the early Middle Ages, is faced with a conundrum. On the one hand, the Gemara says, don't write this down. On the other hand, the Gemara is written down for him. So how does he explain that? He says, it was only written down because there was this sort of problematic time where we worried about it being forgotten. And so therefore, it was only permitted to be written down in times when we're concerned that the Torah might be forgotten. Okay, so Rashi has managed to kind of salvage our problem for us, that we are currently learning a written down text that we don't have permission to write down. Interestingly enough, if you are familiar with the Gemara, you will recognize there's a little aleph right over here, if you can see my mouse, and that aleph takes you to the Misor Hashas, which tells you where else in the Gemara this particular sugya, this conversation, appears. So our sugya actually appears somewhere else in a slightly different form. And we see it over here in Tmura, Daf Yudal and Amud Bet, page 14, side 2. And here, sort of in the marked off area, we see the exact same conversation. Derash Rabbi Yehudah bar Nachmani b'Turgemana Deresh Lakish Kitov Achad Omer Kituv Achad Hadvarim Ha'ela the Kitov Achad Omer Ki Al Pi Hadvarim Ha'ela. So we have one pasuk that says write for you these things, and the other pasuk that says because of / Ba'al Peh orally, because of these oral things. How do we create synthesis out of these two antithetical concepts? Lomar lecha, it's to tell you, dvarim shal peh i'ata rashai lo amram bichtav, u'shebechtav i'ata rashai lo amram al peh. So that which is written down, you cannot transmit orally, and that which is oral, you can't write down. V'tana debei Rabbi Yishmael, same thing as before, and the house of Rabbi Yishmael also taught, Kitov lecha et hadvarim ha'ela. Ela ta kotev, aval ena ta kotev halachot. So when it says write for yourself these things, these telling you these things can be written down, but not halachot. Don't write halacha down. Amri dilma milta chadata shani. So while the Gemara is trying to answer this question of why would people write this down? Well, maybe this was a situation where people were learning new things, or they didn't remember things. Maybe this was sort of something that they didn't know, and then how else are you going to learn it? If it's not in your memory, you have to get it from somewhere. And like the rest of us, when we don't know it, we look it up in a book. Maybe they did the same thing. To have Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish, who you may remember as sort of the prime conversationalist from our previous Gemara and Gittin, so they would sort of spend their time learning books of Agadata on Shabbat. Agadata are the portions of the Talmudic texts that are not strictly halachic, but they're very clearly Torah Shabbat Peh. So, but they're sifra, they're books. So how could they be reading books of Agadata if you're not allowed to write Agadata down? That makes no sense. So what's the answer? The Darshe Hachi, and they explained it thus. It lasot lashem hefei Torah techa. It is a time to act for God, so they have sort of annulled annulled is a good word, annulled your Torah. So the traditional reading of that would be Eit lasot lashem, it is a time to act for God, because hefei Torah techa, because they have uprooted or annulled your Torah. But you can read it the way that they want to read it, which is Eit lasot lashem, it is a time to act for God, hefei Torah techa, and therefore you can uproot or annul the Torah. Amri, and they say, Mutav te'aker Torah, v'al tishkachach Torah mi'Yisrael. It is better that the Torah be uprooted than that it be forgotten from Israel. And the great thing about this is now you see where Rashi gets his ideas from. When Rashi talks about this concern about forgetting, he's talking about it because of this exact Gemara, that here we see this very same concern of, oh no, it might be forgotten. If it's forgotten, then we'll lose it, and that's even worse than writing it down. So it is better to take care of the Torah, to uproot it from its sort of particular place in Baal Peh and turn it into something written. It is better to annul parts of the Torah than for it to be forgotten entirely. This is a deeply, deeply contentious idea, and is one of those things that we can only look at in retrospect and like say, oh, okay, that's what's going on here. It's not the kind of thing that we can just stand up and say, oh yeah, definitely, we definitely need to annul this part of Judaism, not to save the Torah. It's one of those, the term is shahad chak, so an hour of desperate need. And it's an interesting one to see that the Gemara is apparently a ex post facto shahad chak, hour of need thing, that lest we lose our entire tradition, we needed to write it down. And and there it is underlined. And the Rambam actually says the same thing. So when he talks about the redaction of the Mishnah, which according to the tradition that we have, was done by Rabbi Yehuda NaNasi sometime around the 2nd, 3rd century. And this is what Rambam says happened. V'hu kol hashmuot v'kol hadinim v'kol habe'urim v'haperushim shesham'u Moshe Rabbeinu. So he collected all of the hearings and all the laws and all the explanations that he heard that were transmitted down from Moshe. V'shalamdu beit din shalachol dor v'dor, and that the courts had decided and passed on to every generation. V'chol Torah kula, in the entire Torah. V'chiber me'akol sefer HaMishnah, and he took that and he redacted from that whole thing what we have, the Mishnah. V'shananu barabim, and he taught it in public. V'nigla l'kol Yisrael, and he revealed it to all of Israel. uktavuhu kulam, and they all wrote it down. Uribtsu b'kol makom, and they spread it out to all different places in the world. K'dei shelo tishkachach Torah shabal pem Yisrael. Exactly what we saw in Gemara, so that the oral law will not be forgotten from the people of Israel. V'lama asa Rabbeinu HaKadosh kach. Why did he do such a thing? Or also, how did he have the authority to do such a thing? V'lo hiniach hadavar kamot shaya. And why didn't he just leave things the way they were? Okay. Rambam tells us, so he saw that there were fewer and fewer students, and the sort of troubles that were afflicting Israel grew new and more numerous. And the evil empire, which for the rabbis would have been Rome, was growing in power and strengthening itself. And Israel was sort of spreading out to all corners of the world. So he created one Mishnah to go into, that everyone could take with them to all these corners of the world, so that it can be taught quickly and not forgotten. And he and his Beit Din, he and his court, sat day in and day out and taught this in public. Whew. Okay, so here's how we got the Gemara. We got the Gemara because first, Rabbi Yehuda NaNasi looked around and saw the situation and realized that it was that continuing to only transmit Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, the Al Peh orally, was untenable, that it was going to get lost. And we were so afraid of that we transformed it into a written text. And then from there, roughly 300 to 400 years later, the Gemara, as the commentary on the Mishnah, was redacted and created sort of this additional layer. And then roughly, in the 12th century, 11th and 12th century, we had Rashi and Tosfot. And then later on, there were continued additions to the page throughout the centuries. So each of these collections is generating more Torah Sheba'al Peh, more oral law, and then adding it to the canon by putting it on the page of the Gemara. Okay, great. So now we know where the Gemara comes from, but there is one question that I sort of want us to take on before we go on to talking about the fascinating history of the Gemara and technology. And that question is, hang on, I'm going to bring myself back to the front. Okay, so why does it matter? Why is it so important that we keep the written law written and the oral law oral? And keeping the written law written, keeping Torah Shebechtav as a written down text makes a lot of sense. That when you are concerned about textual fidelity, when it really matters that every word remain exactly the same, then the best thing you can do is promote sort of a very careful scribal practice and a very careful attention to reading the text. So when we read from the Torah or any of the books of Tanakh in public as part of the tzibur, there's a concept that you are not supposed to memorize the text and just have it in front of you. You are actually supposed to read every word. If this is an experience that may be familiar to some of you, if you've ever read Megillah, you've probably been told about this, that you have to be very careful not to know the text so well that you're not even reading it off of the Megillah, because you have to read it because it's Torah Shebechtav. So that makes a lot of sense. We understand why, when we are so concerned about fidelity, when we are so concerned about keeping the Torah the way it was given to us, when sort of the idea of trying to keep the Masoretic text as the same as possible, despite the fact that we continue to copy it over with Sofrim, despite the fact that Torah scrolls eventually deteriorate and need to be put in a Geniza and we need new ones. This is the best way we have to make sure that the text we have looks exactly the same as the text that exists in the Gemara. And we actually do a pretty good job. So that's one side. Now the other side, why don't we do that with Torah Sheba'al Peh? Why don't we have the same concern for textual fidelity when it comes to the teachings of halacha? And this is sort of a fascinating question that gets debated among modern academics. Like, what does it mean that the Torah is transmitted orally? And 20th century scholarship tended to fall on the side of saying that, well, they took notes, and those notes existed either because sometimes they needed to look it up, kind of like the Gemara and Tamura made it sound like, or maybe their notes were just to aid their own memory, but when you were learning, you had to teach in public just from your memory. You just took note, and then students would take notes and just keep compilations, but teaching always happened sort of in public. That was Dr. Shal Lieberman's approach. There were other suggestions that it was only after we created a strong oral culture that we started writing it down. The reason that people have this question is because we actually know that so much of the Tosefta, like the additional teachings of the Tanaim that didn't make it into the Mishnah, were carried over through notes. So like we know that these notes existed. And if they existed, that means somebody was writing them down. And if someone was writing them down, someone was apparently going against this teaching, and that's a problem if what the teaching really means is you can never write it down. So that's how sort of 20th century academics were trying to grapple with that problem. More recently, we're coming to, in academia, a slightly different understanding of what something means to be oral, that we're no longer really thinking about it as pure transmission through voice or pure transmission through writing, but that those aren't quite as separate as we thought. And what distinguishes the oral from the written is not necessarily whether there's ever any trace of it on the page or not, but how it's understood among people. Is it something that's sort of performed and done in a group and done with like a teacher leading it, or is it something that's kind of done solitarily or with a book? The best example I can think of in terms of turning it into a modern understanding is it a song or is it an audiobook? So a song may have sheet music, may have orchestration. You may be able to sort of see a written form of it. You might be able to look up the lyrics, but in its true form, it's a performance. It's something that is done slightly differently by every singer who takes it on. It's something that gets its power when it is performed. So even though you can write down a song isn't really meant to be written down. A play isn't meant to be read. A play is meant to be performed. A song is meant to be sung. That's Torah Sheba'al Peh. That while it may have this written existence, and that written existence is part of what's important for preserving it, its true form exists in getting up and teaching it, as opposed to Torah Shebechtav, which is lahavdil, an audiobook, where the audiobook is a particular performance of the book, but the goal of the audiobook is to bring as much as possible the writer's vision to life, to stray as little as possible from what the writer wrote. You don't have permission to add fancy trills or words that the author didn't intend when you are narrating an audiobook. And often many people don't enjoy reading audiobooks. They want to encounter the text for themselves. So that's kind of our experience at Torah Shebechtav, that we have people who lane it for us and they read it, but their job is to be a medium for God's voice out of the Torah. They're not trying to perform it themselves. As opposed to in Torah Sheba'al Peh, we hear all the voices of all of the rabbis in our tradition who have made Torah possible, who have made halacha possible, who have come up with their understanding of halacha, and that becomes part of our understanding of it. So when the Gemara talks about halacha, there's this, in some circles, well-known Gemara that is called the Tanur Shel Achnai. And I'm not going to get into it because it's long and contentious and a shir in and of itself, but there is a moment in it where the rabbis say the phrase, Lo b'shamayim hi. And the point is that the decisions we make about Torah are our decisions. Halacha is something that we do. And that when we say Torah is Lo b'shamayim hi, that doesn't mean that we are not following God's will, because we absolutely are. What it means is that God has given over the possibility of understanding and interpreting the Torah to us. And in order for us to do that, the Torah needs to have a component of orality to it. We need to feel that when we get up and perform halacha and make it our own, that we really have a say in it, and it's really ours in a way that Torah Shebechtav, when it's Tanakh, when it's sort of this narrative text that God has given us, shouldn't be ours in the same way. It's a gift from God, and therefore it stays sacrosanct, as opposed to halacha, which is a different kind of gift from God, and it's a gift that's meant to be used. So that's the oral written distinction, and now we understand why we lost the orality. But one of the amazing things about the Mishnah and the Gemara is we didn't really lose it because of the way that the Mishnah and the Gemara is written. In particular, the Gemara, which it sounds in many cases just like a raucous conversation in the Beit Midrash. We see these different groups of rabbis who are constantly arguing with one another, and we hear both their voices, and we don't often know where the Gemara is going in a particular sugya until it gets there. So we see the trajectory, we see the people in the Beit Midrash who are like, that story you told me reminds me of another story about that same person, and the Gemara takes off in a completely different direction, which is so much more like a conversation than like a book. So despite the fact that it's written down, the Gemara amazingly manages to convey so much of what it means to be an oral text, even in the writing. So we have that preservation, we have that sense that Gemara in some ways only makes sense if you learn it with a chavruta, when you engage in that back and forth yourself. So what it really preserves for us is that sense of orality, is that sense of being in conversation with a teacher who heard it from another teacher, who heard it from another teacher, who is learning with you, kind of like what we're doing here. And tracing a traditional path that Rambam understands is going all the way back to Moshe, that we are just like another link in a very long chain of people having this conversation. And the important part is the conversation, the fact that we had it with those who taught us and they had it with those who taught them, all the way back. And you can't have that with a book. You can't really be in conversation in the same way. So the Gemara, for all its confusingness that I honestly really think is intentional, exists precisely to make us have these conversations and to make us learn together as a community. So that's my Gemara spiel. As for the second part, I'm going to transition a little bit and talk somewhat about how, now that the oral law exists in the form that we know it, now that we have this concept of a written down Gemara, how did we get from scraps on a piece of paper to this book right here? And there are three technological stages that I think it behooves us to talk about. And the first, this is probably not where you thought I was going with this, is the invention of the book. And by book, I mean this thing with a spine and pages that opens like this, that we read like this, as opposed to a scroll, as opposed to a Sefer Torah, which we read very differently. And there is one particular thing that books are really good at. Books are really good at being able to read two parts of them at once. So, you know, with the scroll, if you want to see something in Bereshit and then you want to compare it to something in Bamidbar, then you have to remember what's on Bereshit and either roll the entire Sefer Torah, which is a terrible idea, or roll the whole thing till you get to Bamidbar and hope that you remember at that point what was going on in Bereshit. Scrolls are really not good for looking at two things at once. Books, on the other hand, books are great. Books are the kind of thing where if you want to flip to the end and look at the last page just to find out what happens, you can do that and then go back to the beginning immediately. Scholars often call this discontinuous reading, by which they mean being able to read in two different parts of the book at once. And the general academic idea is that this transformed Christianity because of the way that they related to the Bible. They tend to miss what it does to Judaism because they are like, oh, well, we still lean from a Torah scroll, which is true. What they don't notice is that it kind of transforms the way we understand the Gemara. And you see this more than anything else in Tosfot. So the Tosafists are a group of writers who are on the outside of every page of Gemara. This page of Gemara happens to have a lot of my notes on it, but you can see them here anyway. And so they are these guys up in this corner. And they see their job is not just explaining the Gemara, but their job is also to make sure that the Gemara is always in harmony with itself. So whenever there are two sugyot that deal with a different topic, Tosfot comments on them. And Tosfot makes sure that if the interpretations are the same, he tells you how they're the same. If they seem to be in tension with one another, then he resolves the tension by explaining the sugyot in a way that makes them make sense. So one of the things, I say his because for some reason we tend to refer to Mefarshim as individuals. The Tosafists are a group of people, probably led by Rabbi Yehudah, but not just him, and many of his students were also part of it. But there's a tendency to just say Tosfot does as like a group, in the same way that you might talk about a organization these days doing something. So think of Tosfot as like an organization for the purposes of my grammatical coherence. So Tosfot, in creating this synthesis out of the different parts of the Gemara, they couldn't have done that without a book. They couldn't have done that without a codex, which is the technical term for this style of book. Because they needed to be able to flip from one page to another in order to bring sugyot in the same masachet into conversation with one another, in order to make sense out of disparate parts, in order to keep their fingers on like 3 pages at once, in order to look up what's going on, you can only do that in a book. So there's a tendency to overstate what technology can do. And technology is only as good as the people who are using it. And so the Tosafos are amazing, and they really, really changed the way that learning was done and the way that the Gemara is understood, because we always go to them to resolve questions of how a particular part of the Gemara is meant to be interpreted. But they couldn't have done their work. They wouldn't have thought to do their work if the technological underpinnings weren't there. And that's kind of the case that I want to make throughout this entire conversation. The technology doesn't do anything on its own. What technology does is it allows for the people who have brilliant ideas to bring them to the forefront. And the next example is printing. And this is kind of the obvious one, the invention of the printing press, which you may not know this, but is actually kind of a big deal. Let me see if I can show you what an original printing press looks like. Okay, so this is, this is a press. This is a remake, as far as we understand, of what Gutenberg's original press would have looked like. It is, you can tell it's huge. The way that printing works is you have each of these individual letters. This is technically a ligature, so it's two letters stuck together. And you put them in the press in the order that is relevant to make a page. So once you've had every other letter set up, then you stamp down the page, and you stamp down as many copies of the page as books that you're going to make. So if you're going to make 200 books, then you make 200 copies of the page. You empty it out, you rearrange the letters to do the next page, and so on and so on. And so you now have 200 copies of a book by the time you're done with it. The reason this is so cool is because otherwise, before this, the only way to get another copy of a book was to pay either a sofer or a monk, depending on whether you're Jewish or Christian, to write it out by hand. So every time you needed a new copy of the book, somebody had to write it for you. This meant every time you needed a new copy of the book, it made no difference whether you were making 1 copy or 100 copies or 1,000 copies. And it was a game changer for, obvious reasons. The Gemara was one of the first books to be printed. It wasn't the first. Obviously, the first book to be printed was the Bible. One of the first 2 Jewish books to be printed was first the Siddur, then the Chumash. Rambam was in there really fast. But pretty soon, in the year 1484, I want to say 1484. I might be wrong. The first Gemara was printed, and it was printed by a man named Joshua Solomon Sonsino. And he didn't print the whole Gemara, he's just printed certain Masechtot. And in the colophon, which is the printer's mark at the end, you saw this passage from his editor, Rabbi Gabriel of Strasbourg, talking about him as a leader and as a figure and the importance of printing. And they understood what they were doing. So I'm reading about most of the way down the 3rd line, print books so that they will provide 2 well-known benefits. First, that a large number can be made and the world would be filled with knowledge, point 1. And second, that their price will not be as high as the price of copies written with quills, iron pens, or lead. And those who lack the means to acquire those expensive copies will be able to purchase these cheaply. And in place of gold, they will bring silver. You should note, Rabbi Gabriel is quoting, or technically misquoting, Yeshayahu, Parak Samach, Pasuk Yud Zayin, where Yeshayahu talks about sort of in times of redemption, instead of copper, they will bring gold, and instead of wood, they will bring silver. So he's reversing it to make a point that in this case, books are cheap, or printed books are cheap compared to manuscripts. They were still sort of prohibitively expensive for the average person, but a wealthy person could own a library instead of, like 2 books. A Beit Midrash could probably afford a significant number of books instead of being able to only afford 1 book, and that 1 book was probably a Sefer Torah. So, and then also point number 1, this idea that the world would be full of wisdom, that the more books you can print, the more people have access to knowledge, the more people will understand, the more the world will be filled with knowledge, which is great. And which is sort of, we call ourselves people of the book for a reason. We love books, we want them to be disseminated throughout. This is what printing does. Again, it's an example of what technology makes possible. And in this case, the thing that technology made possible is the distribution of the Gemara basically across Europe. Suddenly, people who otherwise could not have afforded any copy of the Gemara. Communities that couldn't have ever have had in their Beit Midrash can suddenly afford the Gemara. Sansino was actually not the most prominent printer of the Gemara. That honor goes to a German Christian named Daniel Bamberg, who was the first person to print a complete Shas. The other really important printer for our purposes is a man named Marco Giustiniani in the middle of the 16th century. And what he printed was a gorgeous version of the Talmud that had an index that we still use today. And this index consisted of the Ein Mishpat, the Ner Mitzvah, and the Torah Or. So let's see if we can find them on this page. I need a page that I didn't write on so you can actually see what's going on. Okay, this page is not bad. Okay, this is the problem with all of your Gemaras having been learned in. So you have over here the Ein Mishpat Ner Mitzvah, which shows you where else in the halachic literature these sugyot appear, and where the topics are discussed and where the psak turns up. And then in the margins of the page, like over here, is the Torah Or, which gives citations for every pasuk that is quoted in the Gemara. Partially, this is a side effect of books being so readily available. All of a sudden, you can sort of expect that everyone might have a Tanakh and a full set of Gemara and a full set of Rambam in their Beit Midrash, and so actually needs an index that will tell them where else they can look to find out more information. Also, in order to put this together, you need access to an extraordinary number of books. And clearly, Giustiniani's printer, who was a man named, hang on, I never remember his name off the top of my head, Rabbi Yehoshua Boaz ben Shimon Baruch from Catalonia. And he prepared all these three things, which first of all is an enormous undertaking, so I kol hakavod to him, but also could not have been possible without a printing press where it was really easy to make these small marginal notations on the side of the page, and kind of more importantly, was just accessible. And also you didn't have to make it again and again and again in the way that, you know, we would, if you were writing it by manuscript, then every single page would need those original notations. In this case, you can just do a full print run and never have to worry about doing it once it's already been done. So that was sort of the magic that printing was for people, this understanding that there's no difference between doing one book and doing 100 books and doing 1,000 books, like I said before. It's all the same. It's all just as easy. So that was the printing press. There's a lot written about the impact that the printing press had on sort of the development of Western culture and literacy. I probably can't overstate it, and there are fields of research that deal with this. I want to skip ahead because I have my own like little pet interests, and mine is 19th century printing. The reason I'm so interested in 19th century printing is because of this particular edition of the Gemara. This edition, if you've ever looked at the inside of the first page of a Gemara and you've seen this particular chuppah looking thing, this is not the edition that I have that's all colored in. I definitely have a version like that. And you will see over here in really big letters, Vilna. I'm pretty sure it's turning up backwards on the screen. I'm really sorry about that. And then you will see underneath that, B'tefus v'hota'at ha'amana v'ha'achim Romm. This is published and printed by the printing house of the widow and brothers Romm. Who are the widow and brothers Romm? I'm so glad you asked. So this story takes place in the middle of the 19th century in a town called Vilnius. We know it as Vilna, and we are sort of we are on our way to the 1860s, 1870s. And a couple of things have suddenly happened. The printing house of David Romm, which was run by him and his brothers, has fallen on financial problems. David Romm dies, and he leaves his printing house to his two brothers and his widow, Deborah. And the brothers are just kind of terrible at this whole business thing. And at the same time, for sort of once in sort of 19th century history, the Tsar, who had control over Vilnius at that point, actually lessened some of the restrictions on Jewish printing houses. So there were more printing houses turning up. This house was not turning a profit because of mismanagement. And Deborah Romm was like, you know what, this is ridiculous. I'm taking over. So she contracts with a man named Rabbi Shmuel Shraga Feigenson, who takes over the printing press as sort of the manager, and she remains the owner. And they decide they need to do 4 things, and they need to do them fast. The first thing they need to do is buy out her brothers-in-law because they're basically useless. The second thing they need to do is deal with the problems of the Russian government. So the Russian government would occasionally censor texts, in particular Jewish texts that they didn't want published. This was a really costly operation. If it turns out you printed 2,000 copies of a book and the government says, nope, you can't publish it. Feigenson had the brilliant idea of, why don't we just put the office of the censor on our payroll, and then we'll pay him and send him books in advance, and that way he'll tell us whether he's going to put them in, he's going to censor them when they come out, and if he will, we won't print them, and if he won't, then we can print them, we don't have to worry. So they did that. They basically were like, okay, this is the ridiculous world that we live in, but we can make this work for us. Step 3, I'm editorializing. Feigenson does not actually talk like this, but you'll have a chance to hear what he talks like in a little bit. Was they're going to modernize the press. And earlier in the 19th century, there was this invention called stereotyping. And for those of you who hear stereotyping and assume that it's talking about painting a large group of people with a sort of single, possibly prejudiced brush, yes, that was what I thought the word meant too, until it turns out that that word came out of this particular printing practice. And what it does is, instead of in a regular printing press where you arrange all of the letters and then you print it and then you take the letters apart and rearrange them to make the next page, once you've arranged the letters for the first time, you take a plaster cast of the letters. So like you cover the whole thing in plaster and then peel it off. And then from that plaster cast, you make a lead sheet. So now you have a lead sheet with that page. And the great thing about this is if you ever needed to do a reprint run of a book, you would need to rearrange the letters again. You would need to reset the type. When you have a stereotype, then you don't need to reset the type because you have this sort of large sheet of lead sitting in your warehouse that is already set. So you can just do as many print runs as you need for your publication purposes. This is not useful for like small little philosophical texts that are only going to have one print run because then it's just taking up space. But for things like Sidurim, where about once a year, a shul is going to say, hey, our Sidurim are falling apart. We need to order 50 more. To be able to not have to typeset it and just run off as many copies as you need is sort of incredibly powerful for a printing press. It's a great way for them to make money. It's a great way for them to invest a lot of time and energy in making incredible Sidurim or Chumashim, or if you're thinking of books that your average Jewish town is really going to need a lot of, Gemaras. And that brings us to Feigenson and Deborah Romm's 4th idea. They were going to make the greatest version of the Gemara that the world has ever seen. And I don't talk like this because that's just my hyperbole. I talk like this because that's what Feigenson said he's going to do. So the two of them cook up this idea that's like, we are going to revolutionize the Gemara. We are going to make the most impressive and extensive, with as many sources as possible, with as many commentaries as possible in this book. And it's going to put the Romm printing press back on the map. We're going to be famous for it. Spoiler, they totally are. But because Feigenson is so excited about this, I feel the need to share his language with you. And I apologize for my reading because this copy of the text, which you can find yourself in the archives of the New York Public Library, is not the world's greatest scan, but this is kind of what we have. So in the process of deciding to make this Gemara, they go around and they talk to as many Rebbeim as possible to get a sense of whether there's going to be real demand for this work. So we asked many other wise men. So they were all amazed and they praised the idea of this publication. Except many of them said, so basically it's like, it's a great idea, but nobody's going to pay 1,000 rubles for this. This is so expensive. This is impossible. Well, and I said to my master, or in this case, Deborah Romm, I too am worried about this possibility that we're going to invest all this money in something and lose a tremendous amount because nobody buys it. Okay. To take such a risk of this with our business. But here's my idea. Nachrizna berabim al hotzaot zo v'nikra lachtumim al miknata. So we will publicize the possibility of this publication, and we will call for people to sign on to purchase copies. So basically, if they pay us in advance and promise, then we don't have to be concerned. And if we find that we can get 4,000 people to sign on to promise to purchase our shas, then we will have enough money that we will for sure break even. It won't be a loss. So instead of taking a risk, pardon the language, we're going to kickstart it. So, and the publishers responded to me, "You have spoken well. Rise now and create a sort of a broadsheet to disseminate among the people." And so I did. I prepared this broadsheet and I called it Kol Ram, which is a terrible pun because it means in a loud voice, B'Kol Ram, but it also means the voice of Ram, the voice of the Ram printing press. Bad rabbi jokes are apparently sort of transcending generations. Okay. Im dugmaot miuyot miskatot me'otrot b'perish Rabbeinu Chanana v'Rabbeinu Gershom Meir Hagala v'chadoma. And included in this broadsheet were example pages. Dugmaot me'eza masachtot. So example pages from the masachets that have already existed. As I said, it's really blurry, so I'm trying my best, including the sort of the explanations of Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Gershom Meir Hagola included on this page. V'hifitzoti et hamoadot b'karav Yisrael b'tchilat shanat tafresh mem v'hinei shitu afu aleinu chatumim al miknat hashaf v'ha'ilfas im hatasafta l'rivavot. And so I spread this out. I disseminated this broadsheet in the middle of the year, in the beginning of the year 1880, about telling them the news about our shas with the Rif and the Tosafta and all of these additional things, and more than 10,000 people responded and signed on. If this was a Kickstarter, they would have passed their goal, they would have hit their stretch goals, it would have been amazing. Incidentally, Fagenson actually kind of treats it like a stretch goal. What he does with this extra funding and money is he goes out and he does more research and he finds even more commentaries to add to the Vilna Shas. So if you can possibly find the first edition brachot, you will see on the title page, which I will show you, but this is a Moed Katan and not a first edition, sadly. It says here on the bottom, Yoter mi mea hosafot chadashot nichbadot, more than 100 extra additional commentaries. The original brachot said Yoter mea ba'im, more than 40. So over the course of publication, he actually raised money to go and add additional tosfot. For those of you wondering, here we have Deborah Romm, the sort of financial backer and the woman responsible for bringing this thing into being. And here we have Shafan HaSofer, which is Shmuel Shraga Fagenson's nickname for himself. It was his pseudonym under which he published. And these are the two people who gave us the Gemara that we have today. This is a Gemara that was in many ways made possible because of the invention of stereotyping and the possibility of newspapers, which are the medium through which this particular crowdfunding achievement happened. But it couldn't have come into being without the work that these incredible individuals and their press put in to making it happen. So that's sort of where we are right now. We see the history of the Gemara. We see the history of the development of the daf. And the great thing about the Vilna Shas is it's basically the exact shas that everybody uses. If you go into just about any yeshiva, you will see, this is what the page looks like, just without my commentary on it. Everyone uses it. It's become so visually connected with the Gemara that it's kind of the only version that we think of. And that despite all of the other editions that are out there, people still go back to the Vilna Shas. That's the one that we connect to. So technology has this powerful capacity to change the way that we view things. And it underpins, in many ways, the development of the Gemara as we know it today. So where does that leave us? At the beginning of the 21st century, at the dawn of the internet age, in an era where the Gemara exists in many different forms. Like we have Art Scroll, we have Steinsaltz, we have Sefaria. We're going to talk about my personal favorites. I am deeply, deeply fond of Sefaria as a experimental source for learning new ways to engage with the Gemara. So here we have our Gemara from the beginning in a completely different form, where you can see if I click here and then I click here on Talmud, here's Tumura. And now I can look at both of them side by side. I've reinvented the discontinuous reading of the codex. I've recreated Tosfot. Only, Tosfot did it first, so I didn't have to do all the work. So that's sort of where the 21st century is taking us. We're starting to rethink this question of how do we present the Gemara? And the Vilna Shas is an incredibly powerful tool for traditional forms of learning. And I don't want to minimize how important it is for the Beit Midrash as we know it. And yet, at the same time, technology is also changing the way that we learn. Technology is in some ways bringing back the orality of the original Beit Midrash, so that instead of you learning this Gemara by yourself, either because I told you to it because you're interested in it, you are now here listening to a shiur, listening to the voice of somebody talking about the Gemara and explaining it to you and creating, hopefully, a conversation so that you can talk back to me and tell me what you think of the Gemara. And then we can recreate the orality of the original, distinct from the time and place where I recorded this. We're not going to talk about what hour of the night it is, and distinct from where you are in time. So technology allows us to recapture some of the ideas of the original. It allows us to add new comments and conversations to our own notes in the same way that the early notes created the groundwork that allowed the Mishnah to come into being. So there are all these amazing technological possibilities that I think are out there in the world. I think what we're waiting for right now is someone like Tosfot, or someone like Sonsino and Bomberg, or someone like Deborah Romm and Shmuel Shagaf Eigenson to come and say, here's what we can do. Here are the ways that we can take this tradition and make even the format of the Gemara part of this incredible conversation that we are continuing to have. So I want to close by thanking you all for coming and learning with me, for taking this dive into the Gemara, whether you are sort of old hats at learning or whether this is still new for you and this is only your third or fourth time venturing into the text. And if you are watching this on International Women's Talmud Day, then I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and you go and learn. And if you are watching this afterwards, the same is true. I hope that you sort of take what we've learned today and go back to the Gemara and look for more ideas and look for more things and continue this conversation that began so long ago and make it so that our voices continue to be heard in the voices of our tradition. Thank you so much.